Nobody at the Lone Star Travel Plaza knew much about the night shift janitor, except that he kept the restrooms clean and never caused problems. Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of invisibility, brotherhood, and what happens when the past finally catches up, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe that some people deserve recognition even when they're trying to hide, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The Lone Star Travel Plaza sat at mile marker 487 on Interstate 10, roughly halfway between El Paso and San Antonio in the vast emptiness of West Texas. The facility operated 24 hours a day, serving an endless stream of 18-wheelers, RVs, and passenger vehicles that pulled off the highway at all hours. During daylight, the place was managed by a small staff of cashiers, cooks, and maintenance workers who kept things running smoothly. But from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., the overnight shift belonged almost entirely to one man who cleaned, restocked, and maintained the facility while most of the world slept. Nobody knew much about the night shift janitor except that his name was David. He'd been working there for about 18 months, and he did his job competently enough that the day staff rarely had complaints about the condition of the facility when they arrived for their shifts. He was quiet, kept to himself, and seemed to prefer the isolation of overnight work where human interaction was minimal and most of his time was spent alone with cleaning supplies and the hum of industrial equipment. David Martinez was 42 years old, though his weathered face and the gray streaking his dark hair made him look closer to 50. He stood about 5'10" with a lean, muscular build that suggested someone who'd once been in exceptional physical condition and still maintained basic fitness despite no longer training seriously. His movements were economical and precise, never wasted, and he had a way of scanning his surroundings that seemed more tactical than casual, though nobody paid enough attention to notice these details. The truckers who stopped at the Lone Star Travel Plaza between midnight and dawn barely registered David's existence. He was just part of the infrastructure, like the vending machines or the fluorescent lights, something that existed to serve their needs but didn't warrant acknowledgement as an actual person with thoughts, feelings, or a history that extended beyond pushing a mop and emptying trash cans. When truckers used the facilities, they'd leave their messes without a second thought, knowing someone would clean them up. When supplies ran low in the restrooms, they'd complain to whoever was working the counter without considering that one person was responsible for maintaining an entire facility overnight. When David passed through the dining area at 3 a.m. carrying cleaning supplies, truckers would look right through him as if he were invisible, continuing their conversations about routes, loads, and the endless challenges of life on the road. David had chosen this job specifically because it allowed him to be invisible, to exist without having to explain himself or his past to people who wouldn't understand anyway. After leaving the Army 2 years earlier under circumstances he preferred not to discuss, he drifted through several jobs before finding this position at the rest stop. The overnight shift meant minimal supervision, no coworker to get curious about his background, and enough physical work to keep his mind occupied without requiring the kind of intense mental engagement that might trigger memories he was trying to leave behind. What the truckers and even the Travel Plaza management didn't know was that David Martinez had spent 17 years in the United States Army, with the last 12 of those years serving as a ranger in the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the military's most elite special operations units. He'd completed 6 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, earned 3 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star for valor, and risen to the rank of Sergeant Major before a catastrophic mission had ended his career and left him psychologically unable to continue serving. The mission that had broken David had occurred in the Helmand province of Afghanistan during his final deployment. He'd been leading a 12-man Ranger element, tasked with capturing a high-value target who'd been responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of coalition soldiers. The intelligence had been solid, the planning had been thorough, and the execution had been textbook perfect, right up until the moment when the compound they'd entered had been rigged with explosives that killed 4 of his Rangers and wounded 3 others. David had survived physically intact, but psychologically devastated by the loss of men under his command. The Army had offered him counseling, medical retirement, and various support programs designed to help veterans transition back to civilian life. But David had felt too responsible, too guilty, and too broken to accept help or maintain connections with the military community that had been his entire adult life. So he'd disappeared, changed his phone number, moved away from the military communities where he might run into former colleagues, and found work that required no resume, no references, and no questions about what he'd done before. The Lone Star Travel Plaza had hired him based on a 10-minute interview and his willingness to work overnight shifts that nobody else wanted. For 18 months, David's strategy of invisibility and isolation had worked perfectly. He cleaned, maintained, and serviced a facility that saw hundreds of people every night, and not one of them had any idea who he really was or what he'd done during nearly 2 decades of military service. He existed in a bubble of deliberate anonymity, going through the motions of survival without really living, haunted by memories of Rangers who died under his command. But on a Tuesday morning in late September, David's carefully constructed isolation was about to be shattered in a way that would force him to confront both his past and the brothers who'd refused to let him disappear. The convoy of military vehicles had arrived at the Lone Star Travel Plaza just after 5 a.m., during that quiet pre-dawn period when overnight truckers were either sleeping in their cabs or had already departed, and the morning crowd hadn't yet begun filtering in for breakfast and fuel before continuing their journeys. David had been in the back storage room organizing cleaning supplies when he'd heard the distinctive sound of multiple heavy vehicles entering the parking lot. Not the usual commercial trucks or RVs, but something with a different engine note and movement pattern that his military training immediately recognized as tactical vehicles traveling in formation. His first instinct had been to dismiss it as coincidence. Military convoys used Interstate 10 frequently for movements between bases, and it wasn't unusual for them to stop at rest areas for fuel or breaks. But something about the way these vehicles had entered the lot, the precision of their spacing, and the fact that they'd parked in a coordinated pattern rather than random spots, had triggered alarms in David's tactical awareness that he'd been trying to suppress for 2 years. When he'd emerged from the storage room and looked through the windows toward the parking lot, his heart had stopped. 8 men in army dress uniforms were exiting the vehicles and forming up with military precision that spoke of active duty Rangers rather than reserve or retired personnel. Even from a distance, David had recognized the distinctive tan berets and the way they moved, the controlled aggression, the constant situational awareness, the automatic spacing that characterized elite soldiers even when they weren't in combat. David's immediate instinct had been to retreat, to hide in the storage areas until these soldiers finished whatever business brought them here and departed. But before he could act on that impulse, the front door of the travel plaza had opened and the group had entered with the confident bearing of men who knew exactly where they were and what they were looking for. The lead ranger, a staff sergeant, who looked to be in his early 30s, had approached the counter where Maria, the morning cashier who'd just arrived for her shift, was setting up the register for the day. "Ma'am," the ranger had said with respectful formality, "we're looking for David Martinez. We were told he works here on the night shift. Is he still on the premises?" Maria had looked confused by the sudden appearance of military personnel, asking for the janitor by name. "David? Yeah, he's here somewhere, probably in back finishing up his shift. Is there a problem?" "No problem, ma'am," the staff sergeant had replied. "We just need to speak with him, it's important." David had been standing in the shadows near the hallway leading to the storage areas, his mind racing through possibilities. How had they found him? Why were they here? Had something happened that required notifying his next of kin? Were they here to drag him back into a world he'd been trying desperately to leave behind? The second ranger, a young specialist who couldn't have been more than 25, had spotted David in the hallway and had called out, "Sergeant Major Martinez, sir." The title had hung in the air like a physical presence. Maria and the 3 truckers who'd been in the dining area having early breakfast had all turned to look at David with expressions of confusion and surprise. Sergeant Major. The quiet janitor who mopped their floors and cleaned their bathrooms had been a sergeant major. David had remained motionless for a moment, trapped between the desire to retreat and the ingrained military discipline that made ignoring direct address from soldiers nearly impossible. Finally, he'd stepped forward into the light, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone of someone trying to maintain control. "I'm not Sergeant Major anymore, just David. And I don't know why you're here, but I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." The staff sergeant had moved closer, his expression showing a mixture of respect and determination. "Sir, with all due respect, we've been looking for you for almost 2 years. The regiment needs to talk to you. Your Rangers need to see you. And you need to know that what happened in Helmand wasn't your fault." The words had hit David like physical blows. These Rangers had tracked him down after 2 years, had somehow found him working the overnight shift at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, specifically to tell him something he'd been unable to believe or accept despite countless counseling sessions and his own rational analysis of that catastrophic mission. "You don't know what you're talking about," David had said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. 4 good Rangers died because I led them into that compound. 4 men with families, with futures, with everything to live for. They died following my orders. They died doing their jobs, sir, another Ranger had said, stepping forward. This one was older, probably late 30s, with Master Sergeant rank insignia visible on his dress uniform. They died as Rangers, on a mission they believed in, led by a sergeant major they trusted completely.
That's what we do. That's what we signed up for.
The truckers in the dining area had gone completely silent, their breakfast forgotten as they'd watched this unexpected drama unfold. Maria had stood behind her counter with wide eyes, trying to process this new information about the quiet man who'd worked the night shift for 18 months without ever mentioning his military background. David had felt his carefully constructed emotional barriers beginning to crack under the weight of seeing actual Rangers from his regiment, hearing them speak words he'd desperately needed to hear but hadn't been able to accept from therapists or counselors who'd never worn the uniform or led men in combat. "Why are you here?" David had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The staff sergeant had pulled a manila envelope from inside his dress uniform jacket. "Sir, the regiment is dedicating a memorial next month. A wall with the names of every Ranger we've lost in the past 20 years. Your 4 Rangers from that Helmand mission are on that wall, and the regiment wants you there for the dedication. More than that, your surviving Rangers want you there. The 8 men who made it home from that mission have specifically requested that you be present." The envelope had contained formal invitation to the memorial dedication ceremony, along with letters from the surviving Rangers of David's final mission. Each letter had expressed the same basic message. They didn't blame him for what had happened. They understood that combat involves risk and sometimes good people die despite perfect leadership, and they needed him to stop punishing himself for circumstances that had been beyond anyone's control. Over the next hour, as David's overnight shift officially ended, and the morning routine of the Travel Plaza continued around them, the Rangers had shared updates about the regiment, news about mutual acquaintances, and stories about how David's leadership and training had influenced their careers and saved their lives in subsequent deployments. The truckers who'd been present during this unexpected reunion had watched with growing understanding and respect. The invisible janitor they'd been ignoring for months or years was actually a highly decorated special operations veteran who'd led some of the military's most elite soldiers through multiple combat deployments. One of the truckers, a Vietnam veteran himself who'd been having coffee and listening to the entire exchange, had approached David after the Rangers had finished speaking. "I've been stopping at this rest area for 5 years, the trucker had said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "Must have seen you cleaning 100 times. Never once thought to thank you for keeping the place running or ask if you needed anything. I'm sorry for that, and thank you for your service, both your military service and the work you do here." The apology and acknowledgement had seemed to break something loose in David. For 18 months he'd been invisible by choice, avoiding recognition and human connection because he'd felt unworthy of both. But these Rangers had traveled hundreds of miles specifically to tell him he mattered, that his service had value, and that his brothers refused to let him disappear into guilt and isolation. David hadn't committed to attending the memorial dedication that morning, but he'd accepted the envelope, listened to his Rangers, and for the first time in 2 years, allowed himself to consider that maybe he deserved to heal rather than hide. The Rangers had departed an hour later, leaving behind contact information and an open invitation for David to reach out whenever he was ready. The story of their visit had spread quickly through the trucker community that frequented the Lone Star Travel Plaza, and David found that his invisibility had been permanently shattered. Truckers who'd been ignoring him for months began acknowledging him by name, thanking him for his work, and occasionally sharing their own military experiences or family connections to service members. The morning cashier, Maria, had started bringing him coffee and breakfast from the diner, refusing to accept payment and insisting it was the least she could do for someone who'd given so much in service. 3 weeks after the Rangers' visit, David had made a decision. He'd called the number on the envelope and confirmed his attendance at the memorial dedication ceremony. He'd requested leave from his job at the Travel Plaza, and to his surprise, his manager had not only approved the time off, but had offered to donate his unused vacation days to ensure David wouldn't lose income while attending the military ceremony. The memorial dedication had been exactly as difficult and cathartic as David had feared and hoped. Seeing the names of his 4 fallen Rangers etched permanently in stone had brought all the grief and guilt rushing back. but being surrounded by rangers who'd served with him, hearing from the families of the fallen who expressed gratitude for his leadership rather than blame for their losses, and finally accepting that combat involves sacrifice that no amount of perfect planning can always prevent, had begun a healing process that David had needed for 2 years. When David had returned to the Lone Star Travel Plaza after the ceremony, he'd been changed in ways that were visible to everyone who'd witnessed his transformation. He still worked the overnight shift, still cleaned and maintained the facility with the same competence he'd always shown. But he was no longer invisible by choice, no longer hiding from human connection or avoiding acknowledgement of who he was and what he'd done. The truckers who stopped at the rest stop during overnight hours began to see him differently, not because David had suddenly started wearing his military service on his sleeve, but because they'd learned to look past the surface and recognize that everyone has a story, and some of the most important stories belong to people doing quiet, essential work that keeps the world functioning. David Martinez never fully escaped the guilt and grief of losing rangers under his command, but he learned to carry those burdens differently, accepting that honoring their sacrifice meant living well rather than hiding in isolation and self-imposed punishment. And the rangers who'd tracked him down to a rest stop in West Texas had taught everyone present an important lesson about brotherhood, loyalty, and the understanding that some people deserve to be found even when they're trying to disappear.